welcome to ORF US Dispatch, a monthly in conversation with my senior colleague and the head of the ORF US initiative, Dhruva Jaishankar. In this series, we discuss all things US elections 2020. So let's get started. Dhruva, Bernie Sanders has finally dropped out. He has now endorsed Joe Biden much earlier than his slow-walked endorsement of Hillary in late July 2016. Do you think this will work out well for the Biden campaign?
Well, I think it's obviously, in some ways, I think a lot of Democrats were very worried about the possibility of this going down to the convention, a brokered convention, leaving much less time for the Democrats to campaign, to rally behind a single candidate for the general election, presidential election in November. And that's somewhat akin to what happened in the past. I think in some ways there's a sense of relief that there's an early sense of who the Democratic nominee will be. Now the question though will be how much of Bernie Sanders supporters, many of whom for whom it was basically Bernie or nothing, how many of them will actually be enthusiastic about coming out, whether it's in terms of contributions, whether in terms of volunteering, or whether it's in terms of actually coming out on election day to vote. So I think it still remains to be seen the sort of enthusiasm that Bernie brought to the campaign, particularly amongst youth voters, whether that will actually now translate in Joe Biden's favor.
Okay, but do you think he has enough time to now pivot to a national campaign and also bring these Bernie voters, the progressives, into his fold? Because now COVID-19 is also delaying primaries. It's sort of pushing the timeline tighter.
That's actually been a big wild card. In some ways, at least for recently, the focus has shifted a bit to the mechanics of the election. And whether more states would allow, voting by post, by mail, than in the past. This is one of those things that plays in favor of Democrats traditionally, because a lot of people who otherwise cannot go to vote on voting day, because election day is not a holiday, and so it really disadvantages people, for example, who are working multiple jobs, particularly blue collar workers. And students and other people, so it disincentivizes them to come out to vote. So a ballot by post would actually increase play in the Democrats' favor. Republicans are highlighting that this increases the chance of electoral fraud and such things. So that's where currently the fight seems to be raging. But I suspect it will move to other issues as well, which will tilt the field in favor of Democrats or Republicans, just based on things like voter turnout.
Right, but also on the pandemic, it has sort of reduced Biden to live streams from his couch, and it has also sort of stopped his fundraising. And according to a report which was, I think, released yesterday, he is behind by $187 million as compared to Trump's war chest. How do you think the Biden campaign is now going to innovate?
They'll have to see. I mean, I think that has been a bit of a setback. I mean, and not just that. Trump also gets free publicity effectively by going out and doing press conferences. As the incumbent president. So he's getting a lot more coverage, free coverage in some cases, than Biden is. On the other hand, Biden has tried just recently. His last few ads have really gone on the attack. They have basically tried to blame Trump for bungling the coronavirus response. In a very strange way, actually, by highlighting that he has said good things about China. So it's a very strange that the Democrats are now attacking him for being too cozy with China, and I wonder whether that will actually color some of the campaign rhetoric going on. But obviously, this has brought a halt to a lot of things, and of course, may have been a factor in the timing of Bernie Sanders pulling out of the race as well.
Right. One last question with respect to COVID-19. So, as you mentioned, the Democratic convention has sort of also been pushed to late August now. So that sort of makes the timeline a little tighter, in the sense that the last debate will now happen in the final weeks of October, and that would be barely 10 days before voting day in November. How do you see the election panning out amidst the pandemic?
There are a lot of uncertainties right now. The Democrats had hoped that the convention, being in Wisconsin, being in Milwaukee, which is one of the key swing states, it may in fact prove to be the decisive state. that would help. But again, if that is now in question, and even if it happens on a smaller scale, the effect of that will be lost a little bit. Again, the timeline. In the past, it's been questionable as to how much debates have actually played a role. Some people argue. I recall, for example, in 2012, Mitt Romney did very well in the first debate, and Obama, who had enjoyed a healthy lead until that point, it sort of the odds flipped after that first debate. The second debate, Obama came much better prepared, but you did see a noticeable change after that debate. And then in the Democratic primary debates, the performance seemed to match in some ways fundraising. Also, Kamala Harris had a huge bump after the first debate when she went on attacking Biden. But I think there are a lot of people who still question how much these debates matter. I mean, I think Hillary did very well in those debates against Trump, and yet, of course, that didn't really materialize on election day. So let's see how much that plays a role, whether the reduced timeline for the debates actually plays again in favor of one or the other. It may not make much of a difference at all. But the convention will be interesting. You may see a bit more of a sprint. In some ways, I mean, perhaps this might be a good thing overall. I mean, the US has an extraordinarily long election season by any country's standards. I mean, there's campaigning for months. I mean, if you count the primaries, it's almost 1.5 years of campaigning before every presidential election. So in some ways, perhaps they're bigger, they're more important things right now with the coronavirus raging in the US. Perhaps it would be good to have a more reduced campaign season.
Right. All right. Before I let you go, I want to know your predictions for Biden's VP nominee. As we know, he has already committed to having a woman on the ticket. Give me your top three on this.
Well, just a little context on that. I think the two factors that are important. One is at present, Biden seems to enjoy about a 6 to 7% overall national in polls, is doing better by about 6 to 7% over Trump. It's much narrower in the swing states, 1% in some cases, in places like North Carolina and key swing states like that are very much closer. The second factor to keep in mind is that Trump still is polling very well in terms of how people view his approach to the economy. And despite the fact that we almost certainly will see a contraction in the U.S. economy in the next few quarters. And he's polling 53% on average in his handling of the economy, and 10% more people approve of him than. So I think those are the key figures to look at, and also perhaps what's weighing on Biden's mind when he picks a vice presidential candidate, and also his campaign in general. So, I think there are three broad choices to go with. One is, you go with somebody who's a strong campaigner, has a big name recognition, and is a progressive candidate. And Elizabeth Warren comes to the top of the list, and if that is the case. Second is he really benefited from support from the African-American community, and he needs African-American voters to come out in large numbers. And this is one place where Hillary seemed to suffer in before. So do you pick an African-American voter who will energize that base? Kamala Harris is also sort of somewhat progressive, made a decent, credible run. So she would stand out. Or do you reward somebody who was a relatively early backer of your campaign, who from a Midwestern state or swing state, somebody like Amy Klobuchar? So I would say those three people. I mean, not necessarily that he would go with one of those three, but they represent in some ways three slightly different strategies for how which I think they'll be keeping in mind for who they want to appeal to when they come. So Elizabeth Warren will help with the youth vote to some degree. Kamala Harris with the African-American vote, Amy Klobuchar with the sort of swing voters. Which of those three takes priority? That I think is probably what's going to weigh on the campaign's mind.
Right. A quick follow-up, if I may. So I get you on Kamala Harris because Biden lost California. So Kamala Harris, as the senator from California, can possibly deliver that for him. He lost it on Super Tuesday to Bernie, the biggest prize on Super Tuesday. But what about many people are saying coronavirus is going to bear heavily in the election. So what about someone like Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer? She's been sort of at the forefront with Governor Cuomo to take on the federal response on COVID-19 and sort of has become a prominent face. Do you think Gretchen Whitmer could be one of the picks?
Yeah, there are a number of, there's a much longer list of people, including from the South, some prominent female politicians. who some governors of Midwestern states who would feature potentially feature in the long list. Again, I was highlighting people who probably who all ran for president, all had in that process developed a level of name recognition nationally. But I think largely depends on what kind of strategy they do. Do you want to go for a progressive? Do you want to go for a reinforce the moderate wing, which seems less likely, I think, but is a possibility. But again, Biden will really need African American voters to come out in large numbers and Hispanic voters to come out in large numbers on election day to swing things in places like Michigan, as you pointed out, Wisconsin. Minnesota, Ohio, and North Carolina, those key swing states, Pennsylvania.
All right. Thanks, Dhruva. Hope you enjoyed the first episode of the ORF US Dispatch. Until next time, goodbye and stay safe.